So today we are going to go over the stimulus question test review for extra credit or to boost up your scores for your multiple choice questions because we did not do too hot. Now, that's going to come down to studying better and identifying ways to study better and to pay attention in class and all those things, whether you're taking notes or taking better chapter notes. But that being said, I do want to focus on how we can improve our grades in this aspect because I feel like we can attempt and analyze these stimuli better. So, in groups of 2 to 3, you will have an opportunity to get plus 5 questions, which equals to roughly about 10% of your final multiple choice questions by explaining and breaking down a stimulus and showing that to the class. It is going to be a 3 part, which I'm going to model for you today. The first step is you will look through the stimulus and break down the question. So you're going to source it. You're going to identify the source, kind of like what we did for the Boston Massacre, right? Really trying to identify who's saying it, what the time period is, and possibly a title to a speech or the cartoon or the graph or drawing, right? So this will help you know what the questions will likely be about before you even start reading the questions, right? But the second part is reading the questions. So see if you can possibly narrow down the focus within the stimulus. I'm looking for your thought process as you're reading it. Obviously, you can sketch out script out some of the things that you're going to say because you want to make sure your video is clear and concise and not full of like well, maybe, you know what I mean. The second part is reading and breaking down the stimulus, which consists of annotating and looking for answers to the question that you had read. And then step 3 is eliminating answers that do not make sense. So explain why the answer doesn't make sense, find the answers that do make sense, and provide your rationale. Okay, so here's the first part we're going to look at. Let's source. I'm going to source this, and this is Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857. So I automatically go into the time period of 1857. Now, not all of the sources happen within the time period. Sometimes it's like a historian writing about it. But for the sake of this, it is a court case in 1857, which places us right smack down in the middle of period 5, 1844 to 1877. So as I look to the source, if I know it, awesome. I'm already like 3 steps ahead, actually, right? But let's just say I don't know what happens in Dred Scott versus Sanford. I do know it has to do with the Civil War and civil rights, right? So let's read the questions to help me maybe give some clarity to what I might be looking for as I read the stimulus. So, question number 1. What effect did the above ruling have on previous American legislation regarding slavery? So, I'm looking for legislation, laws that were made regarding slavery before 1857, right? So, I'm trying to see what this stimulus or what Dred Scott versus Sanford might have done to either change or enhance legislation regarding slavery. The second question is the court's ruling in the excerpt is most indicative of which of the following developments in American society during the years leading up to the Civil War. So I am approaching this with a mentality of understanding, well, what happened during the Civil War, right? The nation was split to the Union and the Confederates. And how does whatever was ruled in Dred Scott versus Sanford show that what happened in the Civil War? How do we draw a parallel to that, right? And the third question is which of the following sets of Supreme Court decisions demonstrate the strongest similarity as a decision above? Now, I acknowledge that we have not learned many of these court cases, but what the test does here is that it gives you some piece of information if you look at A, B, C, and D that will help lead to it. But I do need to know what Dred Scott versus Sanford is. So I've just read the questions. I've identified what I'm looking for, right? Parallels to the Civil War, as well as the ruling that how did it affect slavery, okay? And now I'm going to read and break down the stimulus. So I'm going to go into this preview, which you should have on your Mac to so you could screen share this, right? And I'm going to click this little highlighter thing, right? And I'm going to highlight as I read. I'm going to try to identify some of those things. It has been settled by the decisions of the highest court in Missouri that by the laws of the state, right? So obviously it's just talking about this is a court case. A slave does not become entitled to his freedom where the owner takes him to reside in a state where slavery is not permitted. So this is the core aspect of this case, right? This is the introduction. A slave does not become entitled to his freedom where the owner takes him to reside in a state where slavery is not permitted. So I'm going to do my best to summarize that point, right, in a little text box that I'm adding right here. So slaves don't become free when owner brings them to free states. Okay, so even in states where there was no slavery, owner can bring a slave up there, and that doesn't mean just because he steps on free land that he's free. Okay, now if you knew the court case of Dred Scott versus Sanford, you would know that without even having to read that, right? And afterwards brings him back to Missouri. Conclusion. It follows that it is apparent upon record that the court below erred in its judgment on the plea in abatement and also erred in giving judgment for the defendant when the exception shows that the plaintiff was not a citizen of the United States. So there's a lot of like legal jargon in here, but this part is what I'm identifying right here, right? So the exception that the plaintiff was not a citizen of the United States. What do you mean he wasn't a citizen of the United States? Well, if you knew the court case or if you researched it, you would also understand that slaves are not citizens, right? So they have no legal standing. And as the circuit court had no jurisdiction, either the case stated in the plea in abatement or in the stated in the exception in its judgment in favor of the defendant is erroneous, meaning it is wrong and must be reversed. So we now identify that Dred Scott versus Sanford is a court case that was reversed when the slave was free, quote unquote, but now no longer can be free because this court ruling reversed it, right? Because two reasons. Slaves don't become free when owners bring them to free states. That was the main course of it, the thing. But also the major thing in Dred Scott versus Sanford is that slaves are not citizens, therefore they cannot sue in court. Okay. Now, I'm going to now go into these questions. I feel like I have a good understanding of this. Now, the question that I want you to ask yourself is this. Well, did you really need to read? If you knew what Dred Scott versus Sanford was and the main court case, like main ideas of it, do you need to read this? And the answer is no. I'd say about 30 to 50% of the questions, if you actually know the source and know the questions and the answers, you don't even need the stimulus, right? The stimulus is there just to jog your memory, right? Think of what the word stimulus means, right? To jog, well, I guess in this case, to jog your memory, right? Stimulate your thinking. So, what effect did the above ruling have on previous American legislation regarding slavery? So, I need to know what happened before 1857 on slavery. So, I know that the Fugitive Slave Act existed, right? But did this invalidate the Fugitive Slave Act, right? The Fugitive Slave Act said that slaves must be returned to their masters. This is saying the invalidation of the Fugitive Slave Act is absolutely false, right? If it said it validated the Fugitive Slave Act, maybe that's a little bit. So I know right here that this is probably false. I'm going to take the pen and I'm going to draw an X, right? So probably not A. It strengthened the provisions of the Northwest Compromise. Well, the Northwest Compromise didn't have anything to do with slavery. So this one should have been automatically out in the first place, right? It validated the black codes of the South. Did it strengthen the black codes, which is, well, you can't teach them to read and write and whatnot? Well, possibly, right? Like, it has to do with with slavery. And then it declared the provisions of the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. Now, here's the key part, right? You need to know what the Missouri Compromise says, right? And sometimes you're like, oh, they said Missouri here, and they said Missouri here, therefore they're trying to trick me, so I'm not going to do that, right? Again, you need to know again, what the Black Code says and what the Missouri Compromise says, right? And so remember, like that's going to take some memory, right? And in this case, the answer is D. It declared the provisions of the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, meaning that slaves, just because they step on free land, and remember the Missouri Compromise, they gave Missouri as a slave state, and and even in Missouri, right? Um, when slaves were moved around, that they just because they moved to a free place, that they're not no longer free, right? Sorry, that was a little circular, but um, again, you must know that. And here's where you could define the Missouri Compromise, and you could define the Black Codes of the South, and that's where you would be able to help find that answer, right? Again, I'm not asking you to retake this test and try to explain it without knowing it. You can do the research before, and that'll help you. So let's go to question number 2. The court's ruling in the excerpt is most indicative of which of the following developments in American society during the years leading up to the Civil War. So, what is a parallel to this and the Civil War? Well, this says that slaves are not citizens, right? And this is saying that just because you go to a place that is free, that does not make them free. So, let's read these questions. The growth of nativist parties and anti-immigrant feelings. Does this question have anything to do with immigrants? I would automatically say nope. Has nothing to do with immigrants. Therefore, I am not even touching that, right? The increasing influence of abolitionist literature in the South. Well, I do know it has to do with the Civil War movement. Is there anything about literature in here? Is there a parallel to it? Well, abolitionist literature um, in the South, I mean, I'd probably say not really. I mean, if you want to, you could draw. I use squiggly lines for maybes. Okay. The growing sectionalism in the United States. Does this show the growing divide in the United States? Is that a characteristic of the Civil War? Absolutely, right? The decrease in. So right here, I like this answer. The decrease in power of established political parties. Now, again, this you need to know that the decreased power of established political parties happens in the early 1800s. In fact, political parties played a major role during the Civil War movement, right? So I would almost say no. So I'm either looking at C and possibly B. Sectionalism makes the most sense right here. I mean, in fact, the growing divide in the United States is characterized here because it's like, well, just because you go to some place that's free, you still belong to me, right? Like that shows sectionalism, right? This divide within the United States. Now, we're going to go to question number 3, which I think is a harder question for sure because we haven't learned about some of these court cases yet, right? So, which of the following sets of Supreme Court decisions demonstrated the strongest similarity as the decision above? So, this decision again said slaves are not citizens, they can't sue. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, decisions defining individual rights. Well, definitely sounds that individuals have rights, right? So I'm going to draw a squiggly here. Decisions establish the strength of the federal government versus the state. Well, you could argue that this shows that um, the federal government is telling states what to do, right? Um, so I'm going to put a squiggly line there too. Decision on limiting the rights of citizens. Well, here's where you notice a key word, right? This key word right here, citizen, and the key word right here, citizen. I'd say we're getting somewhere, right? I actually like this answer a lot. Decision affecting minority groups and special rights. Wow, like all these questions, this is definitely a question where there's multiple answers that could be right based off of this first thing. So where are we going to go to? Well, obviously your knowledge of these cases matter the most. And when we're talking about individual rights, I mean, this is not about just individual rights, right? This is about the rights of the entire slave community, right? So I'm actually gonna slash this one out right now. Okay. Um, Decisions establishing the strength of the federal government versus the state. Well, this has more to do with slavery and the issue of, again, like citizenship, right? And so the decision limiting rights of citizens, I'm really liking this answer right here, and affecting minority groups. Remember, right now it's not a minority. This is not a group that even has any rights, right? So that really puts me at B or C. 50-50 really is a great opportunity here, okay? If you whittle down to 50-50, you just give your best guess, okay? Right here, you should definitely be erring on the side of citizenship, and that puts us at C. So that gives us our answers, okay? Um, C, D here, and C. Now, again, we're looking at the key ideas. So I've explained why some answers don't make sense. I've explained why some do make sense, providing a rationale. You're going to repeat that for each subsequent question. In order to get credit, you must work with your group, show the annotations, work on the annotations together, and then you can each pick a question or pick an answer and each explain however you want to work together, but you will be graded on a scale of 1 to 5 based off of your presentation. 1 point for each subcategory of the steps. So source, reading the questions and talking about the focus of the questions. Okay, reading the questions in alone does not give you the point. Annotating, okay, just because you highlight, you need to again look for answers of the question. I want to hear it verbally. We want to hear it verbally. Explaining why answers don't make sense, and then finding answers that do make sense, providing a rationale. That would be awesome. Okay, and again, do your research before, try to understand it, and I think we will be a better class for it. Now, here's how the presentations will work. Once you're done recording, you can use QuickTime Player where you can screen record, or you can all jump into, actually, you should all jump into a Teams call and just record that with someone screen sharing and maybe being the, the annotator and as people are talking, right? Again, you should script this. And then lastly, we're going to be signing up for the different questions, and we're going to do one at the beginning of every class until the end of the semester, okay? And that's going to, once you do it, you're going to get your points. I will give those that want to go this upcoming week the chance to choose first, okay? And we'll actually be starting that this upcoming Tuesday. I think we might need to go to next Friday as well. So that being said, sign up for the schedule. We'll talk about that in class, or we will have talked about that in class, and have a wonderful time. Let's really start to do better, please, on these multiple choice questions and the stimulus. I think it really points to a larger problem of us not really working hard enough. I know, given the circumstances, the expectations are high, but I do believe that we have an opportunity here to be awesome students, right? So let's do that, and I'll see you all later. Bye.